Jack Thompson stared at his reflection in a grimy storefront window. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by layers of worn clothing from a thrift store. His normally perfectly trimmed hair was now matted and unkempt, face deliberately unwashed. The transformation from corporate CEO to homeless man was unsettling in its completeness. The streets of Los Angeles felt different from this perspective. Outside his usual expensive restaurants, he now noticed the steam vents where people huddled for warmth. The coffee shops that once welcomed him now had signs warning loiterers would be reported. Security guards who used to nod respectfully at him now watched him with suspicious eyes. Walking through downtown, Jack experienced firsthand how invisible homeless people became. Businessmen in suits, men who would have greeted him enthusiastically yesterday, now crossed the street to avoid him. Women clutched their purses tighter. Store owners stepped outside to make sure he kept moving. By late afternoon, he reached MacArthur Park. The park had always been visible from his office window, but he'd never truly seen it before. Groups of homeless individuals had carved out territories across the grounds. Some had elaborate setups with cardboard and tarps, while others only had sleeping bags or blankets. A cluster of people gathered near some trees caught his attention. They sat in a loose circle, sharing food and conversation. As Jack approached, trying to mimic the cautious walk he'd observed in others, one man looked up and assessed him. This was Carlos, though Jack didn't know it yet. Unlike the others who ignored the newcomer, Carlos watched him with sharp, intelligent eyes. "First day," Carlos called out, surprising Jack with his directness. Jack hesitated, unsure how to respond. His carefully planned backstory suddenly felt inadequate under Carlos's scrutiny. "Come on," Carlos gestured to an empty spot in the circle. "You're too clean to have been out here long, but too nervous to be a cop or social worker." The others in the group shifted, making space. Jack noticed they were an eclectic mix: an elderly woman with surprisingly neat gray hair, a young man with a backpack covered in patches, and two middle-aged men who could have been office workers a few months ago. As Jack sat down, Carlos passed him half a sandwich. "First rule of the streets, we share what we have. Second rule, everybody's got a story, but nobody's obligated to tell it." Over the next few hours, Jack listened as the group talked. They weren't the stereotypes he'd expected. The elderly woman, Rose, had been a librarian before medical bills consumed her savings. The young man, Tyler, had fled an abusive home. Each story peeled away Jack's preconceptions about homelessness. But it was the mention of Mia that caught his attention. The group spoke about her with obvious respect, how she'd gone from pursuing an acting career to becoming a fierce advocate for the homeless community. How she worked at the shelter despite having nothing herself. How she refused to let her circumstances dim her spirit. "You should meet her," Carlos said, noting Jack's interest. "She runs the dinner service at the shelter on 6th. Everybody's welcome there." Jack nodded, already planning to visit the shelter. But as he sat there, listening to more stories and watching the sun set over the park, he felt an uncomfortable realization growing. He'd started this experiment thinking he would learn about the homeless situation from a safe distance, maintaining his role as an observer. Instead, he was beginning to understand that there was no such thing as safe distance on the streets. Here, survival depended on community, on trust, on looking out for each other. As darkness fell and the group began preparing their sleeping spots, Jack knew his perspective had already shifted irreversibly. And he hadn't even met Mia yet. The shelter on 6th Street looked nothing like Jack had imagined. Instead of a dark, depressing space, he found a well-organized facility humming with activity. The main room was filled with folding tables where volunteers moved efficiently, serving dinner to a steady stream of people. That's when he first saw Mia. She stood behind the serving counter, directing volunteers with quiet authority. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and despite wearing a faded t-shirt and worn jeans, she carried herself with undeniable dignity. Something about her struck Jack as familiar, but he couldn't place it. "First time here?" Mia asked as Jack approached the counter. Her voice was warm but professional, the tone of someone who had mastered the balance between compassion and boundaries. Jack nodded, maintaining his cover. Up close, he noticed the subtle signs of her own struggles, the slight wear in her clothes, the tiredness around her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. Yet there was something else, a spark of determination that seemed to define her. As he found a seat with his meal, Jack observed how Mia interacted with others. She knew most people by name, asking about job applications, medical appointments, or family members. This wasn't just charity work for her, these people were her community. Later that evening, Jack overheard Mia speaking to a group of women in the shelter's small common area. They sat in a circle of mismatched chairs, sharing stories. Jack positioned himself nearby, pretending to read a donated newspaper while listening. "I had it all planned out," Mia was saying, her voice carrying a hint of old pain. "Graduated from drama school, had some decent roles in local theater. Was even close to landing a TV commercial." She paused, running a hand through her hair. "Then Mom got sick. Dad had already left years ago, so it was just us. The medical bills." She shrugged, leaving the rest unsaid. The other women nodded in understanding. One reached out to squeeze her hand. "But you know what?" Mia continued, her voice strengthening. "Those acting classes taught me something important, how to put on a brave face when everything's falling apart. How to walk into a job interview like you belong there, even if you slept in a shelter the night before." Jack found himself leaning closer, drawn in by her words. He recognized the technique she described, the same one he'd learned in corporate boardrooms, though under very different circumstances. "Sometimes I miss it," Mia admitted quietly. "The stage, the lights, that feeling when you become someone else for a while. But then I think about what we do here, how we help each other survive, and it feels more real than any role I ever played." An idea began forming in Jack's mind. He thought about the empty community room in the shelter, the way Mia's eyes lit up when she talked about acting. Maybe there was a way to help her reconnect with her passion while helping the community. After dinner service ended, Jack approached Mia again. "I heard you talking about theater," he said, carefully maintaining his rough accent. "Ever thought about doing something here? For the community?" Mia looked at him skeptically. "What do you mean?" "A performance. Something to bring people together. Give them something to look forward to." Jack tried to sound casual, though his heart was racing. "I used to. I know a bit about organizing events." For a moment, Mia just studied him, and Jack worried he'd pushed too far, too fast. Then she smiled slightly. "You're new here. What did you say your name was?" "Jack," he replied, realizing too late he should have used a fake name. "Well, Jack," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, "that's an interesting idea. But we barely have enough resources for basic needs, let alone putting on shows. Sometimes," Jack said carefully, "the things we think we can't spare time for are exactly what we need most." Something in his words seemed to reach her. Mia's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained cautious. "Let me think about it," she said finally. "But no promises." As Jack left the shelter that night, he felt both excited and uneasy. He'd taken the first step toward helping Mia rediscover her passion, but he'd also taken the first step down a path of deception that would eventually have to end. The shelter's community room had been transformed. Volunteers had pushed the usual folding tables against the walls and arranged chairs in rows. Someone had rigged a makeshift stage area using donated sheets as curtains. It wasn't Broadway, but the energy in the room was electric. Behind the sheet curtains, Mia paced nervously. She'd chosen a monologue from The Glass Menagerie, a story about dreams and harsh realities that felt painfully relevant. Jack watched from the doorway as she mouthed the words silently to herself, her hands trembling slightly. "I haven't performed in front of anyone in 3 years," she admitted when she noticed him. "What if I've lost it?" "You haven't," Jack said with quiet certainty. Over the past week, he'd watched her rehearse late into the night, after everyone else had gone to sleep. Her dedication reminded him of himself in his early business days, though he kept that comparison to himself. The room filled quickly. Carlos arrived with his group from the park. Lisa, a young mother Jack had met during dinner service, came with her daughter Emma clutching a flower picked from a sidewalk crack. Even some of the more solitary shelter residents emerged from their corners to attend. When Mia stepped onto the makeshift stage, Jack held his breath. For a moment, she looked terrified, but then something remarkable happened. As she began to speak, her entire demeanor transformed. Gone was the shelter worker in worn clothes, in her place stood Amanda Wingfield, proud and desperate and dreaming. The audience leaned forward in their chairs, captured by her performance. Jack watched their faces as much as Mia's performance. He saw recognition in their eyes. They understood this story of shattered dreams and persistent hope. When Mia delivered the line about lives of quiet desperation, several people nodded silently. Lisa's daughter Emma, who had been fidgeting, suddenly went still. Her eyes grew wide as Mia's character described a magical world of possibilities. Jack saw Lisa wipe away a tear, pulling her daughter closer. As the performance ended, the silence held for a moment before erupting into applause. Some people stood, others whistled. Carlos's booming voice called for an encore. Mia stood there, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time since Jack had met her. After the performance, people lingered, reluctant to let the magic of the evening fade. Small groups formed, sharing stories about their own dreams, their own performances in school plays or church choirs. The shelter, usually quiet at this hour, buzzed with energy. "Thank you," Mia said quietly, finding Jack in a corner. "I forgot how much I needed this." "The community needed it too," Jack replied, gesturing to the animated conversations around them. He wanted to say more, to tell her how extraordinary she was, but he held back. His deception about his identity weighed heavily on him. Lisa approached them, Emma still clutching her flower. The little girl thrust it toward Mia with shy determination. "You were like a real princess," she declared. Mia knelt down to accept the flower, her eyes glistening. "Thank you, sweetheart. Would you like to learn how to act too?" Emma nodded enthusiastically. Lisa looked uncertain. We can't." "No cost," Mia said quickly. "Maybe we could start a little drama group. For anyone who wants to join." The idea spread through the room like wildfire. Soon, a sign-up sheet was circulating. Carlos volunteered to help build a proper stage. Someone else knew about lighting. A former high school drama teacher living in his car offered to help direct. Jack watched as the community transformed before his eyes. People who had been isolated in their struggles were suddenly planning, collaborating, sharing skills they hadn't used in years. Mia moved through the crowd, her earlier nervousness replaced by quiet confidence as she organized volunteers and schedules. Later that night, as the excitement finally wound down, Jack found himself alone with Mia in the kitchen, helping clean up. "This could be something big," she said, more to herself than to him. "Not just performances, but a way to help people reconnect with who they used to be. Who they still are, underneath everything." Jack nodded, acutely aware of the irony in her words. Who they still are, underneath everything. If only she knew who he really was. The guilt gnawed at him, but seeing her so alive, so purposeful, made it impossible to confess. "Not yet. You have a gift," he said instead. "Not just for acting, but for bringing people together." Mia looked at him curiously, as if trying to figure something out. "There's something different about you, Jack. I can't quite put my finger on it." His heart raced, but before he could respond, Carlos burst into the kitchen with more sign-up sheets, and the moment passed. Jack watched Mia turn to handle the new tasks, wondering how long he could maintain this delicate balance between helping her shine and hiding in the shadows of his own deception. The shelter's basement had become their unofficial headquarters. Jack, Carlos, and Lisa hunched over a folding table covered with papers, event permits, donation lists, and rough budgets. The fundraising event had started as a small idea but had grown into something much more ambitious. "We've got commitments from 3 local restaurants to provide food," Lisa reported, checking her meticulously organized notes. Her daughter Emma played quietly in the corner, arranging chairs for an imaginary audience. "And the church on Highland agreed to let us use their parking lot." Carlos tapped the permit application. "But we still need insurance coverage for the event. And security deposits." He didn't state the obvious, these things required money they didn't have. Jack felt the weight of his checkbook in his expensive penthouse across town. One signature could solve all their problems, but that would mean revealing everything. Instead, he said, "I might know some people who could help." From before. The phrase "from before" was common in their community. Everyone had a before the medical bills, before the layoff, before the accident. No one pressed for details. "You don't have to tell us your story," Carlos said, noticing Jack's discomfort. "But are these people you can trust? We can't afford any complications." The irony of discussing trust while living a lie made Jack's stomach turn. Yes, he said firmly. They're good people. He was thinking of his executive assistant, Sarah, who could quietly arrange the necessary funds through one of his foundation's anonymous giving programs. Later that afternoon, Jack watched Mia working with a group of shelter residents, preparing them for a performance at the fundraiser. She had a natural talent for teaching, helping people find confidence they thought they'd lost. Remember, she was saying to a nervous middle-aged man, "You're not playing a role. You're telling your story. Our story." The man nodded, standing a little straighter. Jack recognized him as a former accountant who'd lost everything in a market crash. Now he would be performing a monologue about resilience and second chances. Lisa approached Jack as he observed the rehearsal. "You watch her a lot," she said quietly. "I'm just impressed by what she's accomplished," Jack replied, trying to sound casual. "Mum." Lisa gave him a knowing look. "You know, Emma asked me yesterday if you and Mia were going to get married like in her storybooks." Jack felt his face grow hot. "It's not, we're not." I know. Lisa smiled. "But there's something there. Anyone can see it. Except maybe you two." The conversation was interrupted by Emma running up to them. "Mr. Jack. Will you help me practice my lines? I'm going to be a tree." As Jack followed Emma to her corner of chairs, he caught sight of himself in a window reflection. His carefully maintained, homeless appearance was becoming genuine. The beard was real now, the calluses on his hands earned from helping Carlos build sets. He thought about his office across town, the meetings he was missing, the decisions being made without him. His phone, his real phone, not the basic burner he carried now, had hundreds of missed calls and messages. His board of directors was getting restless. Sarah could only cover for him for so long. That evening, during dinner service, Jack found himself struggling to focus. The two worlds he was straddling were beginning to collide. When a shelter resident asked him to pass the salt, he almost used the formal table manners ingrained from years of business dinners. Mia noticed his distraction. "Everything okay?" she asked, touching his arm lightly. Her concern made everything worse. It was genuine, based on a version of him that wasn't entirely real. "Just thinking about the fundraiser," he said, which wasn't entirely a lie. "There's so much riding on it." "Hey." Mia moved closer, lowering her voice. "You've done so much for us already. Whatever happens with the fundraiser, you've helped create something special here." Her words, meant to comfort, felt like stones in his stomach. Yes, he'd helped create something special, but he'd done it while living a lie. The community's trust, Mia's growing affection, the children's admiration, all of it was built on a foundation that would eventually have to crumble. As he lay on his shelter cot that night, listening to the quiet breathing of others around him, Jack made lists in his head. In one column, his corporate empire, his responsibilities, his shareholders. In the other, this community, these people, Mia. The divide between these worlds seemed impossible to bridge. Carlos's voice drifted from a few cots over, singing softly to comfort a newcomer having nightmares. Emma's flower, now dried, sat in a cup by Mia's station in the kitchen. The drama group's sign-up sheet had run onto a second page. Jack rolled over, pulling his thin blanket tighter. Tomorrow, he would need to make a quick trip to his office, maintain his corporate facade, sign some crucial documents. Then he would return here, to his other life, to help build sets and review permits and watch Mia teach others to find their voice. The question was, how much longer could he keep both worlds from colliding? The church parking lot had been transformed. String lights crisscrossed overhead, donated tables lined the perimeter with local restaurant offerings, and a proper stage stood at one end. Local media vans parked along the street, their reporters preparing for live coverage of what they dubbed the Street Stage Initiative. Jack stood in the shadows, his heart racing. He recognized faces from his corporate world mixing with shelter residents, potential donors his assistant Sarah had quietly invited. The sight of these two worlds intersecting made him dizzy. "Jack!" Mia called from backstage. "We need help with the lighting." He hurried to help, passing a group of business people in expensive suits. One voice made him freeze. "Quite an interesting little project," said Alexander Reed, CEO of Reed Investments and Jack's longtime business rival. "Though rather quaint." Jack ducked his head, adjusting his worn baseball cap. He'd competed with Reed for decades, but now the men looked right through him. The irony wasn't lost on Jack. The performances began as the sun set. Shelter residents shared their stories through monologues, songs, and short scenes. The audience, a mix of homeless individuals, local community members, and potential donors, sat captivated. Lisa's daughter Emma, playing her tree role with solemn dedication, drew tears from even the most hardened business executives. Carlos delivered a powerful monologue about second chances that had reporters scribbling frantically in their notepads. Then Mia took the stage. She performed a piece she'd written herself, about a woman who loses everything but finds herself. Jack watched from the wings, mesmerized. This wasn't the same nervous performer from the shelter's first show. This was an artist in her element, commanding the space with quiet power. Remarkable talent, Reed's voice came from behind Jack. She could go far with the right guidance. Jack turned to find Reed studying Mia with calculated interest. The predatory gleam in his rival's eyes made his stomach churn. "I believe I'll introduce myself," Reed continued, straightening his tie. "My foundation could certainly use someone with her capabilities." Before Jack could respond, Reed was moving toward the stage where Mia was finishing her performance. The audience erupted in applause as she took her bow, her face flushed with success. Jack watched helplessly as Reed intercepted Mia at the stage steps, extending his business card with practiced charm. She looked surprised but pleased by his attention, especially when he mentioned potential funding for the shelter's arts program. "Your performance was exceptional," Reed said, loud enough for Jack to hear. "Perhaps we could discuss your future over dinner. I know several theater directors who would be very interested in meeting you." The moment stretched like glass about to shatter. Jack saw multiple futures spinning out before him, Mia accepting Reed's offer, building a new life with his rival's help, never knowing the truth about Jack. Or worse, Reed recognizing Jack despite his disguise, exposing everything in the cruelest way possible. "That's very kind," Mia replied carefully, "but I'm committed to this community. We're not looking for individual opportunities." Reed's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened slightly. "My dear, loyalty to a cause is admirable, but one must think practically. These people will still be here if you take some time to advance your own interests." Jack saw Mia's spine stiffen. "These people," she said quietly but firmly, "are my family. And family doesn't abandon family for advancement." She turned away from Reed, moving to help Emma, who had gotten tangled in her tree costume. Reed watched her go, his expression unreadable. Later, as the event wound down and donations poured in far exceeding their expectations, Jack found himself unable to celebrate. He kept seeing Reed watching Mia throughout the evening, making notes on his phone. "We did it," Mia said, appearing beside Jack. Her eyes shone with happy tears. "Can you believe it? We actually did it." Jack managed a smile, but his mind was racing. Reed was known for his ruthless tactics in business. If he decided to take an interest in Mia or the shelter, either as an ally or an opponent, things would get complicated quickly. "You should be proud," he told Mia, meaning it despite his fears. "You've created something incredible here." "We all did," she corrected him, taking his hand. The warmth of her touch sent panic through him. He was in too deep now, caring too much, risking too much. "I should go," he said abruptly, pulling away. "There's something I need to take care of." Mia's face fell slightly, but she nodded. "Will you be back for tomorrow's celebration dinner?" Jack looked at her, really looked at her, knowing he should end this deception now, before it went any further. But the hope in her eyes, the triumph of the evening, the community they'd built together, he couldn't bring himself to shatter it all. "I'll try," he said, and fled into the darkness, Reed's calculating gaze following him as he went. The shelter kitchen was quiet at midnight. Mia sat alone at the prep table, turning Reed's business card over in her hands. The expensive paper felt foreign against her calloused fingers. 3 days had passed since the fundraiser, and Jack hadn't returned. "Can't sleep." Carlos's voice startled her. He pulled up a chair, sliding a cup of tea across the table. The chipped mug had become something of a ritual between them during late-night conversations. "Something feels wrong," Mia admitted. "Jack's disappeared before, but this time feels different. Like he's running from something." Carlos studied her over his own mug. You care about him? It wasn't a question, but Mia answered anyway. I don't know who he is, Carlos. Not really. He appears out of nowhere, helps create all this, and then vanishes whenever things get too. She gestured vaguely, unable to find the right word. Too personal. Carlos suggested. Mia traced the rim of her mug. There are moments when he forgets himself. The way he speaks, how he handles situations, it's like he's playing a role, just like we do in our performances. Only I can't figure out if the role is who he is now, or who he was before. The kitchen door creaked open as Lisa joined them, wrapped in a borrowed sweater. Emma's been asking for him, she said softly. She wanted him to see her new tree dance. The three sat in understanding silence. They'd all seen too many people come and go from their lives to be surprised by disappearances. But this felt different. Jack had become woven into the fabric of their community, his absence leaving a tangible void. You know what's strange? Mia said suddenly. When that investor, Reed, was talking to me at the fundraiser, I saw Jack watching. He looked scared. Not just worried, but terrified. Carlos leaned forward. What exactly did Reed want? He offered to introduce me to theater directors, talked about funding opportunities. Mia pulled out the business card again. But something felt off. It was like he was more interested in watching Jack's reaction than in actually helping me. Have you thought about calling him? Reed, I mean, Lisa asked. Mia shook her head. Every time I consider it, I remember how Jack helped us build all this without asking for anything in return. Reed's offer feels like choosing between two paths, one leading back to my old dreams, and one leading. She paused. Leading to Jack. Carlos finished gently. Leading to who I've become, Mia corrected, but her blush betrayed her. The person who helps others find their voice instead of just using my own. Lisa reached across the table, squeezing Mia's hand. Maybe you don't have to choose. Maybe there's a way to have both. Or maybe Jack's already made the choice for me by leaving, Mia said, the hurt finally creeping into her voice. Carlos straightened suddenly. No. This isn't like you, Mia. You're the one who taught us all to fight for what matters. If Jack matters to you, then fight for him. How? I don't even know where to look. You're an actress, Carlos reminded her. You understand people, their motivations, their fears. Think about Jack, really think about him. What is he afraid of? Mia closed her eyes, remembering countless small moments. Jack's hesitation when talking about his past. His deep understanding of business and organizations that he tried to hide. The way he sometimes stood too straight, spoke too properly, then caught himself. Connection, she said slowly. He's afraid of connecting. Every time we get close, every time the community embraces him more, he pulls away. It's like he feels he doesn't deserve it. Or like he's protecting someone, Lisa suggested. Maybe us. Maybe himself. Mia opened her eyes with new determination. The drama group performs again tomorrow night. He helped build this program. He wouldn't miss it unless he's protecting someone by staying away, Carlos finished. Standing abruptly, Mia moved to the bulletin board where their performance schedule was posted. Then we'll give him a reason to stop protecting and start participating. Lisa raised an eyebrow. What are you thinking? We're changing tomorrow's program, Mia announced, already pulling down the schedule. Instead of our usual pieces, we're each going to tell the story of someone who changed our lives by believing in us. Someone who disappeared before we could thank them. Carlos smiled slowly, understanding dawning. You think he'll come if he knows we're acknowledging him? I think he needs to see what he means to this community. All of it, the good he's done, the lives he's touched, the family he's helped create. Mia's voice strengthened with conviction. He needs to understand that running away doesn't protect anyone. It just leaves us all poorer. As they worked through the night, adjusting the program and spreading the word to other performers, Mia felt hope returning. She couldn't force Jack to stay, couldn't demand explanations he wasn't ready to give. But she could show him that whatever he was running from, whatever truth he was hiding, this community, their community, was strong enough to handle it. Love isn't about deserving, Lisa said softly as they finally prepared to get some sleep. It's about accepting all of someone, even the parts they think they need to hide. Mia nodded, clutching the revised program to her chest. Tomorrow, she would take the stage again. But this time, she wouldn't be performing a role. She would be telling the truth, her truth, and hoping it would be enough to bring Jack home. The shelter's performance space was more crowded than usual that evening. Word had spread about the special program, drawing regular audience members and newcomers alike. In the back corner, partially hidden behind a support column, Jack stood watching, his heart hammering against his ribs. He hadn't planned to come. 3 days of hiding in his penthouse, attending emergency board meetings, and avoiding Reed's increasingly pointed inquiries about that interesting shelter project had convinced him that distance was the only safe choice. But when Sarah, his assistant, showed him the flyer for tonight's performance, Stories of Those Who Changed Us, he knew he couldn't stay away. Emma spotted him first. Her excited "Mr. Jack" nearly made him bolt, but before he could move, Carlos appeared beside him. "Glad you made it," Carlos said quietly. "Though you might want to move closer. There's something you need to hear tonight." "I shouldn't be here," Jack whispered, tugging his worn cap lower. "Maybe that's exactly why you should be," Carlos replied, gently but firmly guiding him toward an empty seat in the middle rows. The lights dimmed. On stage, Lisa stepped into the spotlight, Emma beside her. They performed a simple piece about finding family in unexpected places. Emma, still in her beloved tree costume, added leaves made of paper where she'd written the names of everyone who'd helped them. "And this leaf," Emma said, holding up a green paper heart, "is for Mr. Jack, who taught me that even trees can dance." Jack felt his throat tighten. One by one, performers took the stage. The former accountant spoke about a mysterious friend who helped him rediscover his worth. A teenage runaway described someone who showed her that second chances were possible. Each story, Jack realized with growing emotion, was about him, but not about his wealth or status. They spoke of small kindnesses, quiet encouragements, moments of genuine connection. Then Mia stepped onto the stage. She wore the same simple clothes as always, but something about her presence commanded attention. The spotlight caught the tears in her eyes as she began to speak. "We all wear masks," she started, her voice steady despite her emotion. "Some to protect ourselves, others to protect those we care about. Tonight, I want to tell you about someone who taught me that the most powerful performance isn't about pretending to be someone else, it's about having the courage to be yourself." Jack sat frozen as Mia described their first meeting, the gradual building of trust, the way he'd helped restore her faith in not just theater, but in human connection. She spoke about his contradictions, the careful way he sometimes spoke, the knowledge he tried to hide, the warmth he couldn't suppress. "He thinks he's deceiving us," Mia continued, her eyes scanning the audience. "But the truth is, whatever mask he's wearing, we see him. We see his heart, his dedication, his love for this community. And we want him to know that he doesn't need to pretend anymore. Not here. Not with us." The spotlight swept across the audience, and suddenly Jack understood, they knew. Maybe not the specifics, but they knew he wasn't who he claimed to be. And yet, they'd accepted him anyway. In that moment, watching Mia pour out her heart on stage, Jack made a decision. The weight of his deception, the fear of Reed's interference, the corporate responsibilities waiting across town, none of it mattered more than this moment, this truth. Standing slowly, Jack removed his cap. The movement drew attention, faces turning toward him. He saw recognition dawn in some eyes, those who had seen his photo in business magazines or newspapers. But more importantly, he saw acceptance in the faces of those who had known him only as their friend. "My name," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence, "is Jack Thompson. Not just Jack the volunteer, but Jack Thompson, CEO of Thompson Enterprises." He swallowed hard, looking directly at Mia. "And I need to tell you the whole truth." The spotlight swung to illuminate him, and for the first time in months, Jack stood fully in the light, letting both his worlds collide in a single, transformative moment. Mia's sharp intake of breath was audible in the silence, but he couldn't read her expression through the stage lights. This was it, the point of no return. Everything he'd built here, every relationship, every moment of genuine connection, hung in the balance. But as he looked at the faces around him, Emma clutching her paper leaves, Carlos nodding encouragingly, Lisa holding her daughter close, Jack knew that whatever came next, he'd made the right choice. The truth, in all its complexity, was about to take center stage. The silence following Jack's revelation lasted only seconds, but it felt like years. The spotlight's glare cast harsh shadows across the room, highlighting the shocked faces of the audience. On stage, Mia stood completely still, her script falling forgotten from her hands. "I don't understand," she finally said, her voice barely audible. The microphone caught it anyway, broadcasting her confusion to the entire room. "You're Jack Thompson." "The Jack Thompson?" "Yes." Jack stepped into the aisle, maintaining eye contact with her. "I wanted to understand the homeless crisis in our city firsthand. But what started as an observation turned into something else entirely." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people pulled out phones, quickly searching his name. Others whispered among themselves, connecting dots that suddenly made sense: his knowledge of business, his mysterious ability to secure permits and donations, his careful way of speaking. An observation. Mia's voice had turned sharp, cutting through the whispers. "Is that what we were to you? A social experiment?" "No, Mia, please." Jack started toward the stage, but she held up a hand to stop him. "All this time," she continued, anger and hurt mixing in her voice, "while we shared our stories, our struggles, our lives with you, you were what? Taking notes? Planning your next charitable contribution?" The spotlight operator, unsure where to focus, kept switching between them, creating a dizzying effect. In the audience, Emma began to cry softly, confused by the tension. Lisa hugged her close, whispering reassurances. "It wasn't like that," Jack insisted. "Yes, it started as an attempt to understand, but everything that happened here was real. The connections, the community, the theater program. The lies." Mia interrupted. "Were those real too?" Before Jack could respond, the back doors burst open. Alexander Reed strode in, flanked by several reporters who had apparently been tipped off about the revelation. Well, Reed's voice carried across the room. "The great Jack Thompson, playing at being homeless. This will make quite a story, won't it? Billionaire's poverty tourism exploits local shelter. I can see the headlines now." Jack's face hardened as he turned to face his rival. "This isn't about headlines, Reed." "No." Reed raised an eyebrow, reporters' cameras flashing behind him. "Then what is it about? Improving your company's social responsibility image? Testing the waters for a new charitable foundation? Or perhaps?" His eyes slid to Mia, something more personal. Mia stepped back from her microphone, looking suddenly ill. The implications of Reed's words seemed to hit her all at once, every private moment, every shared confidence, every emotional connection she'd formed with Jack was about to become public fodder. "I trusted you," she said quietly, no longer projecting for the audience. "We all did." Carlos stood up from his seat. "Maybe we should take a break," he suggested firmly. "Give everyone a chance to process this privately." But the reporters were already pushing forward, shouting questions. "Mr. Thompson, was this an official company initiative? How long have you been deceiving these people? Miss, how does it feel to learn you've been part of a corporate publicity stunt?" Jack tried to reach the stage, to explain to Mia, but the crowd and cameras separated them. He watched helplessly as she turned and fled backstage, her exit dignified despite her obvious distress. "Mia, wait." He called after her, but Carlos blocked his path. "Not now," Carlos said firmly. "You've done enough damage for one night." The chaos in the room grew. Some shelter residents were angrily confronting the reporters, defending their community. Others sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation. Emma's tree costume leaves were scattered across the floor, trampled under hurrying feet. Reed moved through the confusion like a shark through troubled waters, speaking quietly to reporters, his expression one of practiced concern. "Of course, my foundation would be happy to step in and provide legitimate support for these unfortunate people." Jack stood in the middle of it all, watching his two worlds collide catastrophically. The community he'd grown to love was fracturing around him. The trust he'd built was crumbling. And Mia was gone. Lisa approached him, Emma hiding behind her legs. "Was any of it real?" she asked softly. The way you helped Emma with her confidence, the late-night talks about hope and second chances, was that all just research? All of it was real, Jack said desperately. Everything except my circumstances. My feelings, my commitment to this community, he stopped, looking toward the backstage area where Mia had disappeared. Your love for her. Lisa finished gently. Jack nodded, unable to speak. Then prove it, Lisa said firmly. Not with money or programs or explanations. Prove it by fixing what you've broken. If you can. But as Jack looked around the chaos-filled room, at Reed holding court with the reporters, at the scattered remains of their peaceful community, at the empty stage where Mia had bared her soul minutes before, he wondered if some things, once broken, could ever truly be fixed. The night air felt heavy as Jack searched the streets around the shelter. He'd shed his costume completely now, the worn jacket, the scuffed shoes, the carefully maintained disguise of poverty. In his business suit, he felt exposed, vulnerable in a different way. The alley behind the shelter was where he finally found her. Mia sat on an old crate, still in her performance clothes, staring at nothing. The security light cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the tears she was trying to hide. Don't, she said as he approached. Just don't. Mia, please let me explain. Explain what, Jack? Or should I call you Mr. Thompson now? Her laugh was bitter. How you used our pain, our struggles, our lives as research for your next corporate initiative. It wasn't like that. Jack moved closer, despite her raised hand warning him away. Yes, I came here to understand, to learn. But everything changed the moment I met you, met all of you. Changed how? Mia stood abruptly, anger finally breaking through her composed facade. Changed into a better story. A more compelling narrative for your board meetings. Look how I lived among the poor, learned their ways, earned their trust. Each word hit him like a physical blow. No, it changed because I found something real here. Something I'd never had in my other life. And what was that? The thrill of deception. The excitement of playing poor while your millions sat safe in the bank. Family. The word burst from him with unexpected force. I found family here. Do you know what it's like up there? He gestured toward the financial district's gleaming towers. Everyone wants something. Every relationship is a transaction. Every kindness comes with strings attached. And what you did to us wasn't a transaction. Mia's voice cracked. You bought our trust with lies. I never meant to fall in love. Mia finished, the words hanging between them like shattered glass. Was that part of your research too? Jack stepped forward, closing the distance between them. That was the most real thing of all. Don't. Mia backed away, hitting the alley wall. You don't get to say that. Not now. Not after. After what? After I helped build something beautiful here. After I learned what real strength looks like from you. After I finally understood what I'd been missing my entire life. You could have told me the truth. When? Jack's voice rose with frustration. When you were first sharing your story about losing everything. Should I have said, by the way, I'm a billionaire? Or maybe during the fundraiser, when you were finally reclaiming your passion for performing. Anytime. Mia shouted back. Any moment in all those nights we talked, all those days we worked together. You had countless opportunities to be honest. I was honest about everything that mattered. My feelings, my beliefs, my commitment to this community, all of that was real. But you weren't honest about who you are. Who I am. Jack's voice softened suddenly. I'm not sure I knew who I was until I came here. Until I met you. The security light flickered, momentarily plunging them into darkness. When it came back on, Mia was crying openly. You know what the worst part is, she whispered. I would have understood. If you'd told me the truth early on, explained what you were trying to do. I would have helped you understand our world. But instead, you let me fall in love with a lie. The words hung between them, heavy with truth and pain. Jack reached out, but Mia flinched away. I'm going to use the money from Reed's foundation, she said quietly. He's offered to fund the shelter's arts program, no strings attached. Mia, you can't trust Reed. He's... What? A liar. A manipulator. Her laugh was hollow. At least he's honest about his intentions. At least he didn't pretend to be something he's not. He's doing this to hurt me, not to help you. Not everything is about you, Jack. Mia pushed past him, heading toward the shelter's back door. Some of us are just trying to survive, to help others survive. We can't all play at being poor and then return to our penthouses when things get too real. What can I do? Jack called after her, desperation creeping into his voice. How can I fix this? Mia paused at the door, her hand on the handle. Maybe some things aren't meant to be fixed. Maybe they're meant to be learned from. She disappeared inside, leaving Jack alone in the alley, surrounded by shadows that suddenly felt more real than all the bright lights of his corporate world combined. The community center's grand opening should have been a triumph. Instead, tension filled the renovated space as two separate groups gathered, shelter residents on one side, corporate donors on the other. The divide Jack had tried to bridge now seemed wider than ever. On stage, Mia stood with Reed, accepting an oversized check for the arts program. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. 2 weeks had passed since Jack's revelation, and the shelter's dynamics had shifted dramatically. Reed's foundation had moved quickly, providing funding but also bringing unwanted media attention. Jack watched from the back, no longer hiding who he was but feeling more invisible than ever. Emma spotted him and waved before Lisa quickly pulled her hand down. The gesture hurt more than any corporate takeover he'd ever faced. Ladies and gentlemen, Reed addressed the crowd, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey. Today marks a new chapter for this community. My foundation is proud to. He was interrupted by the arrival of an elderly man in an impeccably tailored suit. The men moved slowly but purposefully toward the stage, aided by a carved wooden cane. Jack straightened, recognizing him immediately, William Harrison, one of the most respected philanthropists in the city. But it was Mia's reaction that caught everyone's attention. She dropped the oversized check, her face draining of color. "Dad," she whispered into the microphone, the word echoing through the suddenly silent room. The revelation hit the audience like a thunderbolt. William Harrison, the reclusive billionaire who had disappeared from public life years ago, was Mia's father. The same father she'd said had abandoned them. "Hello, sweetheart," Harrison said, his voice carrying despite its softness. "It's been too long." Reed's practiced smile faltered. "Mr. Harrison, this is unexpected." "Is it?" Harrison turned to Reed, his gentle tone carrying a steel edge. "I've been watching your maneuvering, Alexander. Just as I've been watching my daughter. And Jack." Understanding dawned across the room. Carlos was the first to laugh, the sound breaking the tension. "You old fox," he said to Harrison. "You've been coming to the shelter for months, bringing those donated books, sitting in the corner watching everything." Harrison nodded. "I needed to understand why my daughter chose this life. After her mother died, after I failed her by retreating into my grief, I lost the right to simply walk back into her life." Mia stepped forward, trembling. "You were there. All this time. Learning from you, just as Jack was. Though I suspect his education was more profound than mine." Harrison looked at Jack with unexpected warmth. "You did what I couldn't, you set aside your privilege to truly understand this community. To understand my daughter." "This is all very touching," Reed interrupted, "but we have contracts." "Which I've just purchased," Harrison said mildly. "Along with controlling interest in your foundation, Alexander. You should really read the fine print about subsidiary ownership structures." Reed's face turned an interesting shade of purple as he stormed off the stage, shouldering past Jack on his way out. But Jack barely noticed. His attention was fixed on Mia, who stood frozen between her two worlds, the shelter community that had become her family, and the father she'd thought had abandoned her. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked Harrison. "All those months, sitting there, watching." "For the same reason Jack couldn't reveal himself," Harrison replied. "Some truths have to be earned, not just told. I needed to understand the remarkable woman you'd become without my influence. And I needed to see if anyone else could understand that too." He turned to Jack. "You proved yourself not by your disguise, but by how real you were despite it. Every action, every connection you made here was genuine, even if your circumstances weren't. A test." Jack asked quietly. Life is the test, son. Love is the answer. Harrison smiled. And you both passed by failing spectacularly at pretending to be anything other than who you really are. Emma, who had been following the conversation with growing confusion, suddenly broke free from Lisa and ran to the stage. Does this mean Mr. Jack can come back to help with my tree dance? The question, so innocent and hopeful, broke the remaining tension. Laughter rippled through the crowd as Emma climbed the stage, her paper leaves still pinned to her costume. Mia looked at Jack, really looked at him, for the first time since his revelation. You knew my father was watching. No, Jack said honestly. I didn't even know he was your father. But I knew someone was watching, evaluation our project. I thought it was Reed. And you stayed anyway. Even knowing you might be exposed. I stayed because none of that mattered anymore. You mattered. This community mattered. Jack gestured to the room full of people who had become his family. The truth mattered. Harrison stepped between them, placing one hand on his daughter's shoulder and offering his other to Jack. Truth is a journey, not a destination. Perhaps it's time we all took that journey together. Mia looked at her father's hand, then at Jack, then at the community watching with bated breath. The girl who had lost everything, the woman who had built something beautiful from those ashes, and the person she was becoming, all of these versions of herself seemed to merge in that moment. Together, she agreed, taking her father's hand and reaching for Jack's with her other. But this time, no more shadows. No more masks. No more masks, Jack promised, squeezing her hand. Emma tugged at Mia's shirt. Does this mean we're all family now? Mia looked at her father, who had missed so much but was trying to make amends. She looked at Jack, who had found his truth by pretending to be someone else. She looked at the shelter community, Carlos, Lisa, and all the others who had become her real family. Yes, she said, finally smiling genuinely. We're all family now. Just a little more complicated than we thought. As the community center erupted in celebration, Jack realized that sometimes the greatest truth emerges from the deepest deceptions, and the strongest love grows in the unlikeliest shadows. They had all been hiding something, from others, from themselves, but in the end, it was their imperfect honesty that had saved them all.